Now, throughout this first fundamental lesson, Garvey tells us how books are important. And in the middle of the lesson, Garvey does something which is remarkable. This is all about books and reading, how to read. And then, right there, I know a boy who was ambitious to learn. And let's read together what Garvey says. Quote, I know a boy who was ambitious to learn. He had the opportunity of an early school education because he had to work 10 hours a day. But he determined that he would learn, and so he took with him to his workplace every day a simplified grammar, and he would read and memorize passages and the rules of grammar whilst at work. After 1 year, he was almost as expert in the grammar of his language. He was almost an expert in the grammar of his language. He knew the different parts of speech. He could paraphrase, analyze, and construct sentences. He also took with him a pocket dictionary, and he would write out 25 words with their meanings every day and study these words and their forms and their meaning. After 1 year, he had a speaking vocabulary of more than 3,000 words. He continued this for several years, and when he became a man, he had a vocabulary at his command of over 15,000 words. He became an author because he could write in his language by having command of words. What he wrote was his experiences, and he recorded his experiences in the words of his language. He was not able to write poorly at the same age, properly. He was not able to write properly at the same age. And so he took with him to work, which is called in school a copying book. And he prized the copying of letters. Practice, thank you, I'm seeing it at an angle. He practiced the copying of letters until he was able to write a very good hand. He naturally became acquainted with literature, and so he continued reading extensively. What he did, when he died, he was one of the great scholars the world knew. Apply this theory to yourself. Garvey is writing about himself because we know from interviewing people in St. Anne's Bay who were contemporaries of Garvey that he would walk around the town with this pocket dictionary and he'd whip it out and he would say, pick a word, any word, ask me to spell it and ask me the meaning. And if he could tell them, he wagered a penny, I think, a word. So we know that that was his normal practice. But here is Garvey emphasizing the pedagogy, the training of the mind at a very early age. Garvey ends this lesson number 1 in African philosophy with the admonition, read a chapter from the Bible every day, Old and New Testaments. The greatest wisdom of the age is to be found in the scriptures. You can always quote from the scriptures. It is the quickest way of winning approval. In other words, books for Garvey and reading were to empower you. It was to empower and expand your command and therefore your control over the reality that surrounded you. It wasn't just for reading's sake. It was to empower you. So the question, friends, is it pedagogy or is it politics? Or to put it in a slightly different way, is Garvey's politics his pedagogy? You get it? I think, unfortunately, most people who approach Garvey jump ahead and rush to emphasize his politics and do so without paying sufficient attention to the practice of training the mind. In fact, I would say that if you ask me, what Garvey was striving for was to create a racial pedagogy, a pedagogy for the race that would empower the race. Then, of course, you get to the economics and the politics, but without the foundation in this training of the mind, this education of the self, you can't have any politics. Now, in 1937, speaking at Bethel Church, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, in October of 1937, Garvey goes even further. He says, quote, "Watch two families living closely and both earning the same amount of money. One will spend everything on food, while the other will spend a portion on literature for the improvement of the family. In 20 years, see which family prospers more and lives longer. The glutton eats himself to death, while the sensible man, by virtue of his intelligence, feeds his mind equally as he feeds his stomach. And so instead of eating a whole pound of meat, he probably eats less at half the cost and probably spends 25 cents. Interesting. For a newspaper, magazine, or other good book. After he has had his healthy meal, he sits down under his lamp and keeps up with the activities of the world and his community. There goes a man who will one day rise to be of importance in his community. On the other hand, there is a man who wags his stomach and the doctor goes in often. Interesting how Garvey keeps coming back again and again to the lessons from his own early development and uses his own experience as a kind of example. Now, as I thought about this business of Garvey the pedagogue, Garvey the educator, Garvey the trainer of the mind, I began to realize, you see, that there are multiple Garveys. And you can actually delineate Garvey's preoccupation with this role of education and the training of the mind in terms of how he dresses, in terms of how he presents himself. And so what I'm going to take you through now is a sequence of photographs of Garvey showing you the way in which his ideas correspond with the way he chose to represent himself. And this is Garvey in 1920 in the garments of the professor, the educator, the trainer of the mind. That's him in the parade, again with the academic cap and gown. That's him in the attire of the academic. There he is again. And that's him at the August 1920 convention, the first international convention of the Negro peoples of the world, reading the declaration in his hand that our visitor and distinguished young man, Stephen, spoke about, read from the declaration. But notice he has on his academic gown. That's the Garvey that I am emphasizing this evening, the pedagogue. In 1918, at his first address that the US Military Intelligence Division covered, they prepared a copy of it, and notice how Garvey bills himself, Professor Marcus Garvey. Now this is the second Garvey. Garvey, the Commander-in-Chief of the African Legions, a different style address. That's him in August of 1922, taking the salute of the African Legions at the convention parade in Harlem. That's the iconic photograph of Garvey that is so often reproduced. Now, that's Garvey number 2, Commander-in-Chief. Garvey number 3. In 1938, speaking in Plymouth Monserrat in the West Indies, Garvey said, quote, "I do hope I have said something to make you think in the higher terms of life. I am a living evidence of that, and think I can be a fair example to any man who can think correctly. I thought of being the first gentleman in the world, and that is the privilege of every man who lives up to that standard. He may not achieve the goal of being the first gentleman, but he may approach it nearer than many." So now let us look at Marcus Garvey, the first gentleman of the world. You see the silver-tipped cane, the spats, the tuxedo, the cutaway frock coat. That's his wedding photograph of 1929, Christmas 1929. Marcus Garvey got married on Christmas Day, December 25th, inside of Liberty Hall, with about 4,000 people present. I think that's kind of taking it a little far. But at any rate, there is our brother. See, that's the first gentleman of the world. Check our brother, coming down the gangplank with his silver-tipped cane, his spats, his striped banker's trousers, and his cutaway morning frock coat. There he is again, always with the silver-tipped cane. That's him in his velvet waistcoat, presiding over the UNIA convention. That's a picture of him taken here in Jamaica after he returned. That's him in London in 1928. That's another photograph of him as the first gentleman of the world. So, you know, suppose we were to go around this room and take a poll and ask you to vote. We won't, but let's imagine we were going to. And we were to take a poll, and the question was, which of these 3 Garveys is the one that you identify mostly with? Would it be Garvey the pedagogue, Garvey the Commander-in-Chief, or Garvey the first gentleman of the world? That's the 3 Garveys. The thing is, you don't have to choose. Why? Because Garvey, the first gentleman of the world, and Garvey, the Commander-in-Chief, are really sides of Garvey, the pedagogue. In other words, Garvey, the educator, is the central piece of this triptych. The 2 other sides of Garvey have their foundation in this training of the mind and training of the self.